Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I am your host, Andrew Langer. And if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you can also take us wherever you want to go and listen, wherever you want to listen on the many fine podcast platforms out there. If there's a podcast platform out there, chances are you can find the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire on it. If you're listening on one of those fine podcast platforms, you can also watch what's going on in the studio on our YouTube channel. Go and check that out. By the way, you can also at me on Twitter, at Andrew_Langer on Twitter. But leave a review, leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment. We always love those with these, and let everybody know about the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Now, you all know that I'm a tech head. Actually, this is a combination. This interview is going to be a combination of two of my favorite things, interviewing former colleagues and talking about technology issues. Joining us today is Tim Jackson. And Tim Jackson is an author. He's got a new book out. We'll talk about that in a second. I've known Tim for many years. I'm going to read a little bit of his bio here. Tim Jackson stands as a transformative figure in the automotive realm, known for his adept leadership through challenges and growth, from steering auto dealerships through their tumultuous time of the Great Recession of 2008 to 2010, to orchestrating historic expansion in the 2010s, to pivoting for success during the pandemic. Jackson's strategic success in the industry for decades. Tim was the head of the Colorado Auto Dealers Association for many, many years. Before that, I got to know him when he was Colorado State Director for the National Federation of Independent Business. In fact, when Tim shifted from NFIB to the Colorado Auto Dealers, I knew that they were going to be in very good and strong hands because Tim was a great state director for NFIB. Tim, welcome to the Lunch Hour.
Well, thanks, Andrew, and it's great to be on with you. Congratulations on your program.
Thank you. So this is, as we've said, is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. I spend a lot of time in the car. Tim, I don't even think you know this. So I live about 2.5 hours from Washington, D.C. on a good day. And for many, many years, I was doing radio in Baltimore, which is 3.5 hours away. And the I-95 corridor between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia has some of the worst traffic in the nation. Some of it's being ameliorated through easy pass lanes and HOV lanes, etc. It can be a real mess. And many times I have sat there in traffic or approached traffic and said, boy, oh boy, I just can't wait for the flying car. We were supposed to have flying cars right now. This is, by the way, the title. Tim, what's the title of your book?
Dude, where's my flying car?
Dude, where's my flying car? Dude, Tim, where's my flying car?
Well, they are coming. They're coming actually faster right now than I would have imagined. So I'm looking forward to jumping into this with you. And what you just described on your challenges with driving
Yes.
is what we all experience, and especially in metro areas. And I think it would serve us to get this on the table at the outset of the conversation. Local governments and some state governments, and to some degree the federal government, are making it harder for people to buy, own, drive, and park cars. And
Sure.
The way they're doing that is they're not adding capacity, even as an area grows, even as a highway gets busier. They're not adding capacity. And the whole concept, they use a term called induced demand, that if you build more lanes, they'll just get filled up. So let's don't build more lanes. And,
Sure.
and yet the projections are over the next 20 to 30 years that traffic vehicle miles traveled, VMTs, will more than double. And it has actually tripled in the last 50 years. And obviously we're not keeping up with capacity. So I want to get that out on the outset because
Sure.
that really drives. 60 years ago when the Jetsons were on TV, we all wanted to be the Jetsons, and we wanted to be George Jetson and be able to fly above the traffic. But that hasn't happened yet. But there are several projects in the works right now, and love to talk to you about them to make that happen.
Please. Well, yeah, I mean, it's and that's just it. But hold on for a second. I mean, because we talk about this, and you're right. We're pushing people, people are moving further and further out of cities to find affordable housing. though the things seem to be changing. I mean, the problem, of course, with less expensive housing in cities is that there are issues with crime, but people want land. They want to be able to have idyllic childhoods for their kids. So this forces them further out. All too frequently the answer is to build mass transit, but we know that mass transit is far more expensive to build than building roads. So it becomes this situation where they make these choices. I got into it with somebody about this, Tim. They've expanded Interstate 64 essentially between Williamsburg, Virginia and Hampton, Virginia, or Newport News, Virginia. And folks are like, well, why don't they just build trains? I said, well, because first of all, you can't get to where you're going in Newport News via train. And also it costs, I don't remember what the multiplier was between rail and road lanes. And then there's the issue of traveling on somebody else's schedule. We want to be able to travel on our own schedules. We want to be able to get exactly where we're going without having to deal with someone figuring out a route for us. I mean, is that part of what's bound here, Tim?
It is. And and I watch what's happening in DC, and I'm not in DC the way you are, but I watch it. And they've done the same thing there that they're doing in Denver and other metro areas. And when I say they're making it harder for people to buy, own, drive, and park cars, it's not just the lanes. They're making it impossible to park in a downtown, or making it prohibitively expensive. And they're taking lanes away to dedicate to bus lanes or to dedicate to bike lanes. And all with the intent that if traffic is congested, and I had a city council member in Denver tell me this, well, Tim, we don't think we'll get many cyclists through this bike lane. However, our ultimate goal is to make it harder for people to commute, so they'll maybe opt for transit.
Wow. I mean, that's exactly it. It gets into what Cass Sunstein, who is an academic and President Obama's OIRA administrator, it's the nudging policy. It's a way of nudging people into doing what it is that you want instead of outright demanding it. It's funny because I was in Denver over the summer and spent some time in that traffic. I mean, I just had a conversation with folks in New York about the congestion pricing for Lower Manhattan going up the wall for the taxes that they're going to have to pay. In terms of that, you're right. It's all about getting them on. They want to get people into cities. They want to get people into mass transit on the government schedule. But you know this from your years with the Colorado auto dealers. People like the independence that a car provides, don't they?
We all do, and most of us do, and that's the thing. So there's freedom of mobility, and the cars over the last 120 years, 125 years, dating back to Ransom Eli Olds in 1898 and Henry Ford in 1908, have provided that freedom of mobility. They've become iconic symbols of freedom, and they continue to be, even with the distress that governments are putting on them.
It is amazing to me. So, and it brings us to this. Now, obviously, I've seen lots of different kinds of personal, right? What do we call them? We don't call them flying cars. We call them personal aircraft.
There's a lot of different acronyms, but most important to get on the table up front. By the way, there are over 200 companies right now trying to get off the ground with flying cars, and not all of them will make it. Most of them probably won't. But I've moved from, I'm going to say this at the outset too, I've moved from a skeptic to a believer that they will happen. And I've moved from the basic question of if they will happen to the more immediate question of when they will happen.
Sure.
And let's dive right in on what's happening and what's moved me from a skeptic to a believer. Now, let me also say, I sometimes handicap some of the projections of these companies because I think it's going to be harder for them than they realize. So I'm handicapping some of these timeline projections by about 5 years. I've got a friend who's handicapping it 50 years. So a lot of times I say in a presentation, well, sometime between 5 and 50 years from now, that will happen. But that's stretching it out a little further than it should be. But they're vertical takeoff and landing vehicles. And that's, and I'll say I've learned a lot about these in the last 2 years. 2 years ago, I didn't even know how to spell a VTOL, VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing vehicle. But what all of these that are really viable they operate like a helicopter when it comes to taking off and landing. So
Right.
because there's not a 3,000-foot runway in most downtowns in the District of Columbia or downtown Denver or any other downtown New York, there's no place you can put 3,000 feet, dedicated feet of space for a runway. So they have to take off like a helicopter. But once in the air, they literally, the props, there's multiple props instead of one, like a helicopter. The props moved forward and they fly through the air like an airplane. And so a VTOL is the official name, and that's VTOL. They're all battery electric that are coming on board. So the industry likes to call them with a lowercase e, eVTOLs. So
Sure.
if I could talk about a VTOL or vertical takeoff and landing vehicle, I'm generally speaking about a battery electric, so an eVTOL, and they're gaining tremendous investment right now. And I'll be happy to jump in and tell you where that's going.
Well, yeah, I mean, but let's talk, because essentially the way I view them, it's like a larger size multi-prop drone, and I've flown drones before, usually with 4 motors and props on them. I don't think I've ever done anything with 6. I know there are some folks who do, and obviously that technology has advanced rapidly in the last 10 years, especially to make them smaller, more agile. Battery power goes. But here's the thing that I keep coming. Well, no, I mean, they're going to be different from cars insofar as, at least in the near term, they're going to be hampered by the same kind of range limitations that ground-based electric vehicles have, right? I mean, you're going to have to go a certain distance and charge them with but with the added issue being that you can't have big battery packs because of the weight limitations on them. Am I sort of right as I wrap my head around the physics here?
You are exactly right. And let me just say this, too, that the aviation industry has been under pressure, as the automotive industry has, as the trucking industries have, as the shipping industries have, as the railroad industries have, to become zero emission. And frankly, the automotive sector has done better at that than most, but it still has, as you know, a long, long ways to go. They've just really got into it from a percentage standpoint in single digits. But the aviation industry is not even in it at all yet. So this is kind of the aviation industry. By the way, these VTOLs are where automotive and aviation industries connect, or I
intersect.
Don't want to use the word collide, but they intersect. Yes,
intersect.
So the aviation industry is really looking at these VTOLs, these electric VTOLs, to be their answer for zero emission. But they are, as to your point, they're short range vehicles, and I'm glad you were very accurate. I think I'm glad you injected the drone analogy, because drones really are precursors to these VTOLs, and so it actually puts another potential terminology on the table, and I'll go ahead and put it out there. And you could call them passenger drones, and I think that's accurate. And some of them really look like passenger drones that are coming into market.
Well, I mean, because it gets into the issues of the stuff that is driven by the driver or the pilot, or the stuff that is remotely controlled, driven by some central computer, or some driven by AI, because we're going to get to the regulatory issues and the safety concerns here. Actually, let me start with this, because the one thing I have seen, Tim, and you make the analogy in some of the things that I've read that you've written and said, between the leap from the bicycle to the motorcycle, right? And I've seen some drone-based or drone-adjacent personal riding vehicles out there. Most notably, at some point, I thought Dubai was building some airborne motorcycles for their police force. I don't know whatever happened with that, but essentially where you sit astride it like a motorcycle or a jet ski, and you drive it, fly it that way, closer to the ground, though, I guess is the way to do it. Where do things stand with that? And then let's talk. One of the issues, of course, is, again, this is guided by weight, right? Because you have a certain thrust capacity on these props, again, with the range, I'm a big guy, so I wonder about that. But like, I wonder about being able to take a flying car with my wife, or again, getting back to the Jetsons analogy, daughter Judy and Elroy also, and I can't remember George Jetson's a dog, but you to ride with the family, like the family minivan or the station wagon of old. We're a long way off from those. I would maybe not so long. Anyway, your thoughts here. It's a jumble there. I know.
Well, right. There's a lot on the. The Jetsons are a perfect analogy. These vehicles, the VTOLs, the ones that are coming into the space, and I've got 22 chapters in this book on 22 different startup companies. And then
the book again, dude, where's my flying car? Yes, go ahead.
Exactly. And to help sort that out for the reader and to help the public to understand, I'm doing a lot of presentations on these now too, as you may know. And I just say, look, most of these are not going to succeed. I mean, it's not that I hope they do. I wish them the best of luck. I'm glad they're taking that major step forward in technology. But the car companies, in the 1900 to 1920 timeframe in the auto industry, there were 2,000 automakers trying to get started with cars. And now, 125 years later, there are effectively fewer than 25 that produce 98% of the cars, aside from China. And by the way, China is very heavily engaged in the VTOL industry as well, the flying cars.
Interesting.
So, almost all of these are going to be helicopter-like, but with multiple props. And the advantage of that, I was asked at a presentation I did in early January in Phoenix. Somebody said, "Tim, I see where you're talking about these flying cars. To me, they're like helicopters, and we've already got helicopters, so why do we need them?" Well, this presentation happened to be at the Biltmore Hotel, and I said, if you can imagine landing a helicopter here in front of the Biltmore, bringing you to this meeting or taking you from this meeting or lifting you off to take you to Phoenix Airport or whatever you're doing, helicopter, if it's 3 o'clock in the morning, everybody's woke up in the building. So that wouldn't work for the Biltmore. And if it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the dust and wind disruption from a helicopter landing in front of the Biltmore is overbearing as well. So noise and wind disruption or dust disruption is what these VTOLs and the multiple props. And I think you were very accurate when you injected the drone analogy, because just like drones, they have multiple props. Most of these have anywhere from 4 to 6 to 8.
Yeah.
There are some of the startups have as many as 16 props. And that's so that each prop is smaller and has to carry less load, but it's also to help on that noise and wind disruption. And but back to your original point there on weight, the capacity on most of these, and where I see them rolling out first, I'll go there too, is in what is called UAM, urban air mobility. And so to be a solution in metro areas. So if you envision, and you're very familiar with the District of Columbia, and I am too, I've given a lot of tours in downtown DC. So traffic congestion is fierce, and it's not a long ways to Washington National Airport. But if you can imagine, if you were at the JW Marriott or at the Willard Hotel, and you came out and you had a VTOL to go to Dulles, or a VTOL even to go to National, or especially up to BWI, and pick you up there, and it's going to be about a 6 to 9 minute flight. 6 minutes probably to National, and 9 or 10 to Dulles or BWI. And then that unit, that VTOL, urban air mobility, flying air taxis, another terminology, would take you not to where the Ubers and Lyfts drop off in front of the airport, but they would take you right to the concourse. So you'd be getting off the flying taxi and getting on your long haul flight, and they'd already do security at the hotel or do downtown. So that's where I see these taking off, and no pun intended. Okay, pun intended there.
Pun intended.
That's where they'll take off. And once the confidence level builds to where people can see to use a very basic term, they are airworthy, they are safety worthy, they are a viable alternative to taking an Uber or Lyft or taxi to the airport, then I think we'll all want to do it.
Well, and that sort of gets into some of the other issues here, which is obviously the difference between a vehicle that is piloted by the owner, the person piloting it, the person who sits there, the passenger, or one that would be, as I would suspect, if it's a flight that's going to take you from the Willard out to Dulles or up to BWI, one that would have to be done by AI or some central computer somewhere. Talk about the kind of training that would be involved in all of this, or how AI technology and processors, would make it as simple as driving. I mean, that's, I guess, what I'm getting here. Talk a little bit about how we get over the immediate personal safety issues that are involved in terms of the training.
Yeah, well, and that's an excellent. And by the way, it's also maybe a little bit complicated, but
right, sure, but that's
first
fine.
off, they will have to have pilots initially, but ultimately, all of these startup urban air mobility units, flying taxis, VTOLs, flying cars, passenger drones, are starting out needing to be pilot driven. So they'll be driven from inside the unit. And so, as you know, there's a shortage of pilots right now. And right now, if I was a student in let's say, a junior or senior in high school or college, and I didn't know what my career path was going to be, but I like aviation, this is going to be, for the foreseeable future, an excellent opportunity. And so I think all of the job fairs and career consulting in schools need to factor this in, because the numbers of these that are being planned to come into the market, or that we're going to need a lot more pilots.
Hold on, time out for a second, because I want you to come back to this, Tim. I want to interject. It's interesting you say that, because I've got a really good friend whose daughter is a junior in high school right now, maybe even a sophomore in high school, and is working to get her pilot's license. And I think it's you have it accurately summed up, because she knows that there's this shortage of pilots that is happening right now, and she wants to help backfill that. So right now, it would be piloted. So I would not be getting into an unmanned, vehicle outside of the Willard. There would be somebody in there, a taxi driver, who would be driving me, flying me out there.
And that person will have to be certified.
Right.
And this is all on the FAA right now. This is a whole new industry. First off, we ought to say this is a whole new industry that's about to stand, and one that I haven't seen anything like this stand in my 60 plus years on this earth, anything like this. And I doubt if you have. There's been a few industries stand, like the internet. After Al Gore invented the internet, we had to stand the internet as an industry. And cable TV was an industry that stood after broadcast signals from the original TV stations. But this is a whole new industry. So in that regard, it's very exciting. It's going to create a lot of job opportunities, a lot of career opportunities ahead. Pilots, namely among them, and central to it, but also more ground control and more, let's say, servicing of the vehicles and services where they would take off and land, and that's going to be exciting. So the person you talked about, I have some in the presentations that I've been giving, and I say, look, you have exciting opportunities ahead that I wish I'd have had it when I was your age, and take advantage of it. But ultimately, and you alluded to it, it is ultimately planned to go fully autonomous and be, let's say, remote control driven.
So let's set aside for a moment the power generation needs, which I suspect would be less than cars, but there would be power generation records. Let's set that aside for a second, but let's talk about the other kinds of infrastructure. You're right. You don't need a 3,000 foot runway. But obviously, you need to figure out where to land a VTOL in lower Manhattan, or in downtown DC, or in Denver, or whatever. And then you presumably going to have to charge them when they're on the ground, unless you have to account for the and I'm talking about the personal vehicles here, not so much the taxi driven vehicles here, which I would assume would operate very much like Uber's would. But talk about what kind of infrastructure would be required on the ground to service a new generation of personal VTOLs.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, Andrew. It's an excellent question.
Thanks.
And I'm impressed with these startup companies. Some of them they are so far along. Well, let me just say this. They are so far along, they already know where they're going to build the units. And
Wow.
They've established one of them, a company called Joby, Joby, which has roots in, most of these are based in Silicon Valley. That probably doesn't surprise you. But the CEO of Joby actually grew up in Silicon Valley. And then they also bought out the assets of Uber. Uber had an aviation program where they wanted to take their Uber passengers airborne, and it was called Uber Elevate. Well, Uber Elevate is now a part of Joby Aviation. And you mentioned Dubai and our United Arab Emirates earlier. It should be noted that even as you and I are doing this interview, that right now, ongoing to this conversation in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, Joby is there, Archer Aviation is there, and other VTOL companies, some out of China, some out of the U.S. And Dubai and Abu Dhabi is contracting for these urban air mobility services. And more to your point, the services that will be needed on the ground at an airport, those are called FBOs. And FBO is an acronym for fixed base operator. But think of a fixed base operator at an airport, a small airport, a regional airport. Think of it as a service station. So what they do is they service that vehicle, that VTOL, when it comes in and lands. So Archer Aviation, which is one of the rising stars in this new industry, and the CEO is a guy by the name of Adam Goldstein, very sharp, smart, and articulate individual. They have already contracted for FBO services all across the U.S. And some of those are network services, like one is called Atlantic Aviation and one is called Signature Aviation. Those are the two largest FBO operators in the U.S., and they're already contracted for services with Archer Aviation. So what that means is when Archer's over in Abu Dhabi right now, they've got a contract, by the way. Both Joby and Archer have contracts with Abu Dhabi and Dubai for this urban air mobility, UAM, or flying taxi services. And but back here in the U.S., Archer is contracted with Signature and Atlantic to charge these units. So they want to charge them. Let's say let's do taking the trip from the Willard Hotel or from the JW Marriott or the White House to Washington National. You would take off of a pad that you and I would associate it with the helipad. And why they didn't just keep the name helipad, they could have, because they have the same functioning purpose, but they call them vertiports, and it's VERTIPORT. And they will take off from this vertiport, think helipad, wherever in downtown metro areas, and fly to their destinations. The first destinations are going to be prominent destinations like airports. And then when they fly you out to National Airport, as I said, they wouldn't drop you off where the Ubers, Lyfts, and taxis drop off. They'll take you right to your concourse and make it very convenient. But while they're there, then it'll be plugged in to a charger, and these batteries will charge, like some of the fast electric cars charge now, 20% to 80% in about 8 or 10 minutes. And so while they're on the ground, they'll be getting a fresh charge. And so they'll probably always keep them 50% or above if they can.
Right. Well, and so that kind of gets into the other issues. And I want to talk a little bit about regulatory hurdles and also sort of the NIMBY issue. But let's start with with cars, something that I keep wrapping my head around, Tim. And again, this gets more into the issue of the personal, and to an extent, the air taxi side of it. But really, once we get down to the issue of the personal VTOL, eVTOL craft, like when you're driving, there's obviously there are accidents every day. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of accidents every day in cars. but the margin of error is much greater, when you have a fender bender or you run out of gas or, something happens. When you're in the air, the margin of error is much, much smaller. Obviously, once these things get deployed, they're going to have to get beyond that. But how are some of these companies working to bridge this issue of the margin of error for when things go wrong in the air, as things invariably do?
No, well, another excellent question. You ask all the right questions.
Thank you.
So, let's just talk about. Since you brought it up, I want to get into the traffic fatalities. And I think that's a fair subject. I don't, you may not want to spend a lot of time on it, but let's get it on the table here.
Sure.
Here in the U.S. alone, and I've been in the auto industry. I've been defending this for 20 years, but in the U.S., we're killing 40 to 50,000 people on our roads every year. I'm not blaming the car companies, and I'm not blaming the regulators or the cars themselves. Oftentimes, it's driver fault, driver error, right?
Right.
So, but to put it in perspective, the high water mark was 1972, and it was 52,000, and today it's about 42,000. So we're off about 20%. But that doesn't tell the whole story, Andrew, because between then and now, we have increased the vehicle miles traveled, or VMTs, by 300%. And it's been a whopping number of 1.1 trillion miles traveled nationally in the U.S. to 3.3 trillion miles. All the while, we've reduced traffic fatalities by about 20%. Now, is 42,000 too many? Yes, it's too many, but at least we're going in the right direction. I want to say that at the outset. And for those fatalities that do happen, if you break those down, a lot of those, one of the safest places to be, it may surprise you, in a traffic accident is inside the vehicle. Very few passengers inside that vehicle are killed in a traffic accident. And where we've seen the increase is pedestrians, and that's oftentimes pedestrians, sometimes in the wrong place at the wrong time, or cyclists, and sometimes in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I think, and by the way, I'm a pretty avid cyclist, but I think it's insane or asinine to put bike lanes down the middle of the busiest streets and thoroughfares where we have cars. I mean, can't we put them over next to the river or next to the railroad tracks or that's where I want to cycle. I think that's where you'd want to cycle. So we put them, so we're bringing some of these problems on from a public policy standpoint. But now we've talked about the traffic fatalities. Let's go to aviation fatalities. And for all the criticism that we've seen over the last, let's say, 1 to 3 months, especially on Boeing, and their stock price is off about 30% for the year because of their safety concerns, there has not been a commercial aviation fatality here in these United States since 2009. It's 15 years. The number is zero, a big eggshell, and so compare that to traffic fatalities, and it's no comparison. So I think it's important to get that on the table when you're talking about safety, because we'll want these VTOLs to be safe. The day one of these falls out of the air and kills some people is the next day that company's either out of business or the industry is shut down. We've seen it in autonomous cars. We've seen it in autonomous rideshare, and it's not good public policy to do it that way, but that's the way we chose to do it here in our good old US of A.
Right, and that's what I'm getting at here, and again, getting to the issue of autonomous rideshare and the problems that ensues there. So let's actually dovetails nicely into this issue of the airspace and restrictions there, and because this is a little different than the regulatory hurdles, which I know I want to talk about with you. But when you get down to it, again, to use the Willard example or just the DC airspace generally, where there are heightened concerns about security there, or the airspace around New York City where the buildings are all different heights. Obviously they must be talking about mechanisms. Are there going to be specific flying lanes that folks are going to have to I'm sorry, I'm all over the place here, Tim, but to use a pop culture example, in Back to the Future 2, right? The sequel where Doc's car now flies. There are travel lanes in the sky that he has to stick to. Is that what we're talking about? Are there going to be specific corridors that folks fly in? How do we deal with those kinds of issues?
You nailed it when you use the word or phrase corridors, and you're exactly right. There will be designated corridors. Those have not been yet established by the FAA, but it is on their plate to do. I sat next to an FAA compliance officer at a conference in DC, by the way, in September. It was the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's annual Aeronautics and Aviation Summit. And so I just leaned in and I said, I bet you're getting a lot of pressure to get the rules going on these VTOLs. And he took it pretty good. He said, oh yeah, but we're under pressure, but we're going to get it right. And I asked him if they're getting pressure from Congress, and a little bit, but they're going to get it right. But yeah, from a technical standpoint, the way I describe it, and the best way I've found to describe it,
right.
If you can imagine, and this is when I would say either, even if it's pilot driven or autonomous, there will be corridors, and the corridors will be where they can fly. But I'm often asked, well, if the way we've filled up the 405 freeway out around LA, won't we fill up the sky the same way, and won't it become dangerous? If you watch a drone show, since you brought drones into the conversation, if you watch a drone show like a 4th of July or a New Year's Eve drone show, you literally have thousands of drones interacting together, because this is the year of the dragon in Asian culture. New Year's Eve, you had the South Korean dragon and you had the Chinese dragon, and they both had drone shows. Thousands of drones, all, of course, remote control or autonomous. And not only are they staying in the air and not running into each other, they're literally moving and keeping the shape of that dragon intact through their aerial motions. So it can be done. And we're not going to fly them that tight in VTOLs, but that shows we could fly them that tight and still be safe. So there will be corridors, whether they're pilot driven or autonomous. And then I'm often asked, and you may wonder, what happens when you get close to the airport, because that's designated airspace. Well, of course, the airport's going to know, the aviation air traffic control is going to know that there's corridors for the flying cars, the VTOLs. And so they will come in if in DC, because of the national airport mostly being a north-south runway, they're going to come in on the east and west. And probably mostly on the east. Mostly on the west, because they're going to try to get you right to those concourses. Gates. And but they're going to come in not in the space that the 737s and 757s are coming in, but they're going to come in from probably the west side, and they'll have as you mentioned, a corridor. One of I've found to help people understand it is, if you could imagine drawing a tight wire, if you will, just the way that fits in that corridor, doing a tight wire that, like they're traveling connected to the wire. They're really not connected to the wire. But now think of an invisible wire. So that will be their corridor, and they're going to be ultimately very safe.
Well, it's the issue. It's the issue of, with and this is how the drones work with GPS positioning and with, the sort of the sensors about the drones around them. You can get that a level of precision that you probably wouldn't get. I mean, with a regular airplane. I'm just reminded, Tim, I had a drone that was GPS enabled, and I could hit a button and it would knew where I launched, and it was a home button, and it would come straight home, on a very tight course. You mentioned the Biltmore and landing at the Biltmore and the issue of helicopters, and understanding that these are much quieter than helicopters, traditional gas-powered helicopters or jet fuel-powered helicopters are, and that they don't have the same kind of wind. Wind is not the right word, but moving air footprint that traditional helicopters do. Nevertheless, I imagine that there's been pushback, or there is pushback, and alarms raised from communities when folks start talking about bringing them in. We just went through this thing in Alexandria, Virginia, for instance, over the building of a stadium. There's constant discussion about whether or not they should increase the jet traffic in and out of Reagan National Airport. Are you hearing anything about the concept of NIMBY and how these various companies might overcome communities that don't want for a whole host of reasons, real or imagined, these eVTOLs in their midst?
I think you're onto something there, very, very important. I think we will get to that, but I don't think we're far enough along to get to it yet. So, because I think you and I and some of your listeners now are in that 1 percentile level of knowledge of that these are even out there and are coming our way, and that's I'm on this personal mission just to educate the public that yes,
right.
They are coming. And so then I think you will have both on the regulatory side and really from a public policy standpoint, and you've been in this space, a long time like I have been. First, the regulators will be the more hands-on deciding how this is going to work, but you're going to get pressure from local governments, city councils, and state governments, and to say, find a way to make this happen because we need to make it happen.
Yeah, here's what I suspect, right? You'll have normally, and I think to some extent we will be talking about the light touch approach to regulation. Certainly that's what we talk about when we talk about the internet. But I have a feeling that this is an industry that will accept a greater, and I'm not saying overwhelming, but a greater touch of input from the regulators than other new and emerging industries might, because they do want to make sure that the public feels safe about this. Am I reading that correctly? Obviously, they don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but understanding that there are certain risks that are involved here, I have a feeling they're going to be more welcoming of a collaborative approach from the regulators than otherwise might be the case.
I think so. Let me just say, I hope so. Let's say from your lips to God's ear that that will happen, and
straight around to the box office. Yes, yes.
I am starting. I've had one conversation so far with a Denver City Council member, just to say these are coming. And he's been this particular council member has been very. Let's say supportive of mobility, well, without getting into too much detail. But he's pushed back on shutting down lanes and closing parking and making it intentionally harder for people to buy, own, drive, and park cars. So this one was fascinated by this where we're at, but I wouldn't say this individual was an expert on where it's going. So I've actually got a request from another council member in Denver to have this conversation, but I think your analogy, the soft hand of regulation, I think ultimately, like most issues, urban issues, they become the hard hand ultimately.
Right.
And but you have neighborhood groups right now that are making it, that are supporting getting rid of cars. There's a podcast called The War on Cars. And there's a phrase, cars ruin cities. Well, actually, if you look back on history, cars built cities. But now maybe you think they're ruining the cities today, but they actually built your city.
Right.
So, but I think we will have some of that. I think it's too early to tell. Let's say the advocacy groups aren't organized in that space yet, so it's too early to tell how that will play out. But I think there will be pressure on both sides, both to make it happen and to keep it from happening.
I'm reminded, or I'm just thinking about the pushback that various municipalities gave, in terms of Amazon drone delivery and other companies that were talking about drone delivery services. But again, this is a little bit different. The technology is more advanced, so that's what I'm thinking about here. Tim, what am I missing? What else is in the book that we haven't talked about?
Well, and you'd be surprised if I walked you through my entire presentation that I do, because I talk about Amazon drone deliveries and I talk about Walmart package deliveries. That's actually in the presentation. First off, let's say it hasn't happened as fast as Jeff Bezos promised it would happen when he appeared on 60 Minutes about 5 years ago and said, hey, we're going to start delivering packages by drone. And in my presentation, I've already shown the 405. I've already talked about traffic fatalities. I've already talked about traffic congestion and emissions. So I said, why would Jeff Bezos and Amazon want to go to the air with their package deliveries? Because they want to alleviate the traffic congestion, the emissions, and the gridlock. But then I'm often asked, well, do they work? Well, to the extent that they're doing them now, and again, that hasn't rolled out as fast as he wanted. Walmart is test marketing those, by the way, in and around Dallas, on the north side of Dallas, in communities like McKinley and Richardson and Plano, Texas, and others. And if you order a package on Walmart.com, you can push the button and have it delivered by drone. But you may be more knowledgeable about the pushback from those. I really haven't seen or heard of the pushback, but I'm sure there is some, because there's always pushback on any technology. But so far they haven't. As I've told my audiences, if they were dropping packages on runners or pedestrians or cyclists or windshields of cars or the middle of intersections, we would be hearing about it. And since they're not doing that, I think they're working.
There was a great couple of years ago about and I can't remember the country. I'm going to butcher it. Just generally, a country in West Africa, I think it was, where they were delivering blood from a central hospital out to regional clinics via drone, and it was a fascinating story. And I suspect, it'll be a place like Houston or Dallas, someplace like Texas, where there are vast spaces in these urban areas where you'll see these personal or passenger eVTOLs or eVTOLs that'll come out. Tim, I do this every week with my guests. I think it's important. You mentioned that you like cycling. When you're not advocating on these things, I mean, I know this has been a transition to you from the small business advocacy to the auto industry, auto dealer advocacy to now this. But when you're not doing this kind of work, how are you spending your free time?
Well, I do. I guess I release my steam when I'm on that cycle. So I am still a pretty avid cyclist, and I like to do that. I do about 2,000 to 4,000 miles a year on a bike.
Wow.
And I have a lot of fun doing that. But I'm not an urbanist that says, hey, we shouldn't have cars out here with us, because I know that's not practical at all. And but I am an avid cyclist, and I'll continue to be. So, but I like to do that. I like to travel. I like to be in the air, whether commercial or private aviation. I'm fascinated by it.
Have you been up in an eVTOL yet, or no?
The short answer is no, and I want to be. And some people have said, "Why haven't you been?" There was a New Yorker article.
This is why the book is written, because Tim wants to go up in an eVTOL. We need to make this. I want to do the same thing. I want to go up. Part of the reason why I loved when I was actively doing, flying around drones before the feds came in and put new regulations on that. Part of it was the fantasy of being up there. It's one thing to have a camera at the bottom of a drone filming things, but it's another thing to be up there. We all want to take that flight. The book, of course, is flyingcarbook.com. It is titled, Dude, Where's My Flying Car? Tim Jackson, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and I'd be happy to come on anytime you and Matt can arrange it.
Absolutely. So, listen, this has been yet another episode of The Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. As always, if you're watching us on YouTube, check us out on the many fine podcast platforms that are out there. If you're listening to us on one of those podcast platforms, you might want to watch us on our YouTube channel. Subscribe, leave a like, leave some comments, but most importantly, let everybody know, friends, family members, friends, etc., know that you have been watching and listening to The Lunch Hour. I am Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.